Welcome to the Court of History. I'm Sean Wilentz, speaking to you from Princeton University with my colleague, Sidney Blumenthal, down in Washington, D.C. The court is now in session. Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, it's what everybody's talking about today, what has happened, the complete collapse of ABC in the face of what amounts to basically the crudest kind of political censorship, coming from the White House, but also coming from the FCC, in the most, really, I mean, the most heavy-handed doesn't even begin to describe it. It's thuggish kind of way that they've gone about this. I can't think of anything like this before in time in American history. Maybe going back to the Sedition Act in 1798 is the last time I can imagine anything quite.
Was anyone, Sean, imprisoned during the Sedition Act?
There were people in prison. There were people fined very heavily. There were Republican Jeffersonian editors they went after.
Any relatives of Benjamin Franklin?
Benjamin Franklin Beach, who was his, nephew, I think. That's right. Yeah. So yes, I mean, we've seen this kind of repression before.
What did Jefferson call this?
Well, Jefferson called it very much. In his letter, it's called it a reign of witches in 1798. It was a whole series of repressive actions, of which the Sedition Act was one of them. And, this is somewhat reminiscent of that, I think, but in some ways it's more reminiscent of more recent events. Not the same by any means, but attempts to try to, police entertainment, to police, what we get to read, what we get to hear, what jokes we get to hear. That has a little bit more similarity.
Very Soviet-like,
very much so. Even though back in those days it was supposed to be attacking communism in the Soviet Union.
Kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
it's like a reverse Red Scare.
Yeah, I mean,
they imitate the Soviets.
Yes, and
it's inside out.
And Jimmy Kimmel was not a member of the Communist Party, so he's not being attacked by the forces of repression because he's a communist. Rather, he's being attacked because he's making remarks that are not approved by the king, by the Politburo, by whatever. Well, fortunately, we want to get more into this, and fortunately, we have exactly the right person to do that with us today, and that's Clay Risen, an old friend. Clay is a reporter and editor at the New York Times, particularly in the Department of Obituaries, and he's an historian. He's the author of The Crowded Hour about Theodore Roosevelt, which was a New York Times notable book of 2019. He was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Military History Prize. He also oversaw a truly extraordinary journalistic effort to talk about the Civil War at the time of the anniversaries, called Disunion. And there's been a book published from that, and I heartily recommend it. But most recently, he's the author of Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Clay, welcome to the Court of History.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot, Sean.
So let's just pick up on what Sidney and I were talking about. I mean, in your book, you spent a fair amount of time at the beginning not talking about Joseph McCarthy, talking about the background to the Red Scare and how it really originated in Hollywood. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, really, the starting gun of the Red Scare, as it were, was the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, investigation into allegations of communism in Hollywood, and very famously called both friendly, quote unquote, and unfriendly witnesses from Hollywood to Washington. And the friendly witnesses were Jack Warner, head of Warner Studios, Ronald Reagan, Gary Cooper. These were all people who very much avowed to fight communism in Hollywood. But the unfriendlies, the Hollywood 10, were mostly writers, producers, or a couple of directors. And, they were people some of whom had been in the Communist Party. Dalton Trumbo is probably the best known name, but there were others who were famous at the time. But they agreed beforehand to not participate. They appeared, they refused to answer questions. This is the famous, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? They all went to jail for it. And more than that, they were blacklisted. And the blacklist was not a government policy. Rather, and this is where you start to hear echoes today, it was the response by Hollywood executives and frankly by investors. And Wall Street had really gotten involved in Hollywood on the financial side in the 1940s. And their fear of what would happen if they didn't start to lay down a line. And so the blacklist was both a response to government policy, but it was wholly a policy within the industry. And the blacklist ended up destroying countless careers, not just famous people, but the blacklist extended to stagehands. It was anyone involved in Hollywood who had ever not just been a member of the party, but had anything that could be called into question in their background.
They signed the wrong petition, or they've been to the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, and there were any number of communist fronts out there, some of which were understood to be fronts, others that were kind of submarine fronts. And so people would sign petitions or give money not knowing that they were communist fronts. Not that should matter, but
exactly.
And these people had to explain themselves, and in a lot of cases they were just pushed out of Hollywood completely.
Right.
Yeah, Clay, I once had dinner with Julius Epstein, who, with his brother Philip, were the great screenwriters in Hollywood of the era. And they drove Jack Warner nuts and with their pranks. They also wrote Casablanca. Julie Epstein, at the dinner, this is some time ago, he was testifying before the Congress with Fay Wray, who was the actress. Fay Wray was at this dinner, right? And it was a very small dinner. And I forget what they were testifying about. But in any case, Julie Epstein tells the following story. He was dragged before HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was asked whether he belonged to a subversive organization. And he said, yes, Warner Brothers. So, which was very much in the spirit of he and his brother. But, there's a scene that is not in the musical Gypsy I want to bring up, but that is in your book that involves Gypsy Rose Lee. And there was an organization called Red Channels that you describe in your book. This Red Scare turned into a pretty large industry of blacklisting, and people made a lot of money off of it. And it was deeply rooted in the conservative movement of its day. Red Channels listed 151. TV was a new medium, and it listed a new, actors and actresses who were TV and radio stars who should be blacklisted, and musicians as well. And one of them was Gypsy Rose Lee. We've all seen the musical and the movie Gypsy, but there was one network that stood up to HUAC and refused to bow to them or censor them. She was scheduled to be a game show host on ABC. And ABC told them to get lost. And they had integrity. Unlike CBS, despite the Edward R. Murrow, play, Good Night and Good Luck, and the movie, because CBS caved and demanded that 2,500 of its employees, as you note in your book, sign affidavits that loyalty oaths that they were not members of the Communist Party. But ABC now has besmirched its own history, and we've come a long way from Gypsy Rose Lee to Jimmy Kimmel Live. Now Jimmy Kimmel dead.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, NBC as well was not a profile in courage at the time. They actually were responsible for the first post-Red Channels firing. There was a new TV show that they were debuting called The Aldrich Family, and Gene Muir, who was a well-known stage actress, not really, done some movies, but she was hired to be kind of the matriarch of this, and it was going to be her breakthrough role, and everyone was very excited. But Red Channels came out, and Red Channels was a book that they regularly updated and expanded, and it basically was just a list of largely unverified charges that they had accumulated, that the guys behind Red Channels had accumulated. Such and such signed this petition, such and such was seen at this protest. And, they said, we're not going to draw conclusions, but you do what you want. So Jean Muir had been for a couple of months a member of, a front organization. It was Women for Peace or something like that. And so she was not a communist by any means. Wasn't particularly active politically, but when this appeared, people started calling in. There was the Red Channels was a big deal, and also organizations, intermediate organizations like the American Legion, they took it and organized letter writing campaigns and protests. So is sort of astroturf a little bit, but anyway, but NBC and General Foods, which, as many people know, back in the early days of television, shows were entirely sponsored. So General Foods was the sponsor of the Aldrich family. And they said, look, is she a communist? Is she not a communist? We don't know. We're not going to, she said she's not, but we can't take the risk. We're just going to fire her. And
that's the same rationale that Disney is using in what they're doing with Jimmy Kimmel, which is, we have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders.
Right.
And, we just have to protect them, and, that it is what it is. So that's our loyalty. That is what, Bob Iger, who is forever disgraced by this episode, despite his reputation as a corporate wizard, will be left with. So.
Yeah. But there is a difference, isn't there, in that it's one thing to have a sponsor be frightened and threaten to pull the ads and so forth. It's another thing from the White House to be threatening to pull the FCC, threatening to pull licenses of entire television networks. And nothing quite like that happened in the 50s. Did it really?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you're looking for parallels, it's a little different, right? There was never look, no one ever said anything like what Brendan Carr said. Right. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. There was no pseudo mob.
Well, George Raft may have said that in a movie.
Exactly. Clipping a 50-cent piece, right.
But, look, the House Un-American Activities Committee was always watching, and it was constantly holding hearings. And, studios and networks were afraid of negative attention from them. There was also a lot of, and this is sort of in the not constructive, but, a slightly different angle. There was a lot of cooperation with the FBI. And, oftentimes if someone was accused under Red Channels, it wasn't the end of their career. There was a whole industry, cottage industry of clearance, self-appointed clearance officers and people who took it upon themselves to, for a fee, help people get cleared. And one of the things they always said was, if you're in Red Channels, the first thing you got to do is go talk to the FBI and see what the FBI says. This happened, this is not TV, but in Hollywood, Sterling Hayden was a few years later, he was being investigated, and he got in touch with a clearance agent. They said, go see what Hoover says. And, Sterling Hayden's famous, so he actually got a hearing with some pretty senior FBI people. And they said, look, you need to testify. Here's how it works. Here's what you're going to have to do. And the whole thing was this real, almost just a degradation ceremony, because, at that point, and in almost every case, he didn't know anything. Sterling Hayden had been in the party for 3 months. The people he could name were people who had already been named. He didn't know how the party worked. The whole thing was ridiculous, but he had to do it. And as a result, he saved his career. But it's interesting, in his biography or his memoir, he says, look, not a day goes by that I do not hate myself for what I did. And in a weird way, he was a victim as well, despite being having named name
Yeah.
names.
So there's a history to this. I mean, it begins with, the rise of HUAC, but also J. Edgar Hoover latches onto this
Mhm.
as a way to increase his power at the FBI. This is before the right wing was angry at the FBI as part of the deep state.
Yeah.
And they latched onto Hollywood and the entertainment industry. It's the highest profile thing that they could do in the beginning. This is how it started. And there are a lot of people they're in your book whose careers in some ways are promoted by attaching themselves to the Red Scare, being part of the events of it. Ayn Rand is part of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we get the rise of Reagan, too.
Yeah,
as
Ronald Reagan.
figure.
Yeah, Reagan's an interesting character because on the one hand, when he testified in front of HUAC, he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild, and he actually spoke against blacklists at the time. This is actually before the blacklist, but people were talking about it. And he said, look, we don't need it. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. I'm not worried about Hollywood being taken over, but, this is an issue. At the same time, he was an informant for the FBI, and he was, this came out later, but he was telling the FBI, here, you need to look into this actor, this writer, here's what's going on here. So, he had this face of moderation, but he very much was part of that machine.
I got to tell you, Frank Mankiewicz, who I was very friendly with, related to, the great Mankiewicz family in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
Frank told me that Reagan was pretty far left. And Frank was part of the candidate selection committee for Congress in LA. And kept Reagan off the slate because he thought he was too close to the Communist Party.
Interesting, yeah.
And
he did say, he did.
Yeah, he was Frank was a liberal Democrat,
Mm-hmm.
But those distinctions, of course, it was the liberal Democrats, by the way, that really successfully fought the communists, not the conservative movement, to be sure, politically. But Reagan's, his people have not gotten to the bottom of how close he was to the party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he describes himself in one of his memoirs as being, bleeding heart to the point of being hemophiliac.
Yeah,
right?
But that's a kind of cover for.
Yeah, no, right. But I mean, it's there was definitely a transition, from where, like you said, it's maybe not entirely clear. We certainly know where he ended up. But that was, it was a transformation for him. And, look, I mean, even at the time, he was far from the most extreme anti-communist. There were, Gary Cooper was much more adamant.
Adolph Monjou is in your book.
Well, I'm sorry?
Adolph Monjou.
Yeah, that's right. Adolph Monjou.
Right guy.
Was,
talk about it. Was in the Birch Society.
Yeah. I mean, talk about someone who had the sort of...
The real McCoy was a John Bircher? I'm shocked.
And Rand, as you said, I mean, one of the funny things about her, she wrote basically the manifesto of anti-communism in Hollywood, and, the set of rules that you were supposed to follow. And they were things like, don't glorify the common man. Don't demonize the wealthy. And it's, people would say, look, we follow these rules very closely because otherwise we're going to get attacked by, HUAC or the American Legion or, who knows what. But, and there are lots of examples of, films that had to be cut because they had this line or there was, some image that Rand and the new censors determined was anti-capitalist.
Yeah, there was a culture of naming names that developed.
Yeah, no, for sure. I've even seen, and I'm not a film scholar, so I'm not going to stand by this, but there is a line that says, look, one of the reasons why film noir and this whole sort of inward turn of psychological film happened was because it was a safe place. You could make deep films or films with substance that were not political. And, we're very much focused on psychology and sort of the thriller and that interesting idea. I mean, certainly Hollywood did take a very quietist approach by the early 50s, and it took a long time to get past that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you get films, and it's so complicated the way it worked out, but it's going after the culture. This is a culture war. We talk about the culture wars today. It was very clearly, aimed at, they said, that Hollywood had a tremendous impact on the American mind. This is pre-television that's the place we have to get to right away. In other words, if we're going to set up a gigantic propaganda machine, we have to kill theirs first. Yeah. And, that's really what it comes down to, it seems to me. And do you see similarities there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, I think that in some ways what's going on today is an extension of what happened in the 40s. I mean, or in 50s. I mean, my reading of one of my readings of the Red Scare is that it was a deferred fight over the culture that emerged in the 30s around the New Deal, and not just not the policies per se, but that's part of it. The whole idea of embracing true equality, starting to talk about civil rights, women's rights, cosmopolitanism, secularism, internationalism, these values that really were 100% opposite from the values of the 20s and the values of, middle America or, Midwest America, conservative America.
Yeah.
And that
Henry Ford for sure.
Sure. and that what you see in the Red Scare, the subtext is, this culture that we have now been living under is dangerous. It's they would say, oh, this is communistic. What they really meant was, this is not, we want to use this pretext in the Cold War as a way to go back to where things were. And it's striking how little that rhetoric has changed today. I mean, I think that if you look at particularly J.D. Vance, some other figures who are, I think, very deeply ideological, that's what they talk about, is going back to a pre-New Deal, pre-Popular Front, pre-secular America. That's, I mean, I don't think that they're not apologizing. That's what they want. And those are the terms of this culture war.
But there's one thing about this, though, that's also similar, it seems to me, which is the art of the smear. In other words, cherry picking a particular thing out there that exists, and tarring everyone, liberals, what have you, with that. So that, the Democratic Party now this is a slightly different question, not about culture, but the Democratic Party is a domestic terrorist organization. Why? They'll find some crazy quotation from somebody somewhere to justify it. That's what was going on here too, right? I mean, they were finding a way to tar everybody with this brush based on a tiny little example someplace.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we are certainly on the precipice of seeing, potentially something very scary, which is, what is a terrorist, right? And if the courts and frankly the political system gives the administration the leeway to basically say this person or that person is a terrorist, then Katie bar the door. The same thing happened then. I mean, there were no roles from the Communist Party, right? I mean, unless you had someone's card, you couldn't prove that, or you could have witness statements, but it's not like someone had published, here's who's in the party. So you had to go by proxies, witnesses. Were you a member of a front? But in a lot of cases, it was just accusations, which might be anonymous, might be baseless. In a lot of situations, this wasn't a legal proceeding, right? It was a court of public opinion. It was your employer. It was a loyalty board with the government. And that's where things, really became very scary because
Clay, the history of this, as you've written, is that it develops in the beginning as partisan politics. And it's against the New Deal, as you pointed out. And And the right wing tries to establish a continuum of communism to liberalism, as though it's one and the same, and that the New Deal is not only permeated by communists, but it's run by it.
Right.
And that's the partisan nature of that, which actually is a continuum of the right-wing culture war to this day, that particular idea.
Yeah. And, I think it's worth noting that, it's not that there was not a there. Like, the Cold War was real. It was a real issue, an important thing to be focused on. The Soviets did have spies in the United States. This Communist Party of the U.S., at the leadership level especially, was not a good actor, by and large. And, so there were reasons to have these conversations about, well, what is the place of the party, or what is the role of security in the Cold War? But the point that I try to make in the book, and I think is more important, is how that conversation got hijacked and became a partisan tool almost immediately. And I think, there's a rough analog today. Obviously, we're not in a Cold War. We're not, there is no, despite what members of Congress are now saying, we're not in a crisis or an emergency that requires us to set aside free speech. But, you could look at, say, the conversations around DEI. And, yes, there is a conversation to be had about what are the proper limits on, DEI policies. But that immediately and very baldly partisanly, became a weapon, so that anything that could be labeled DEI, including fundamental civil rights protections, suddenly become, a point of attack. And it's that very bad faith reading of, what is on a certain level, like a fair conversation to be had, that I think is both an analog between then and now, and also incredibly dangerous.
Well, we're just coming to the end of our time for the first part of our conversation with Clay Risen. Maybe we should halt at that note. The question of weaponization, a word that is used very, very liberally these days. But for now, we welcome you. We invite you to join us in part 2. But for now, for Sidney Blumenthal and for Clay Risen, the Court of History is now adjourned.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.